was it like growing up in your family?
Well, I had four sisters, um, my dad, and my mom. My mom was pretty sick, but when I was little, but she did typical 1950s mother things. She cooked and raised us.
Who provided the income in your family? What did they do for a living, and how well off was your family?
Well, we weren't. We certainly weren't poor, but we weren't well off. My dad worked for a newspaper his whole life, his whole career, from when he dropped out of school in the 1920s to the
Was
time
there
he
more
died.
than one language spoken in your home or in your parents' home? If so, what was it, and why was it kept alive or forgotten?
We only spoke English.
What did you do in the afternoons after school when you were growing up?
We always had to do homework when we came home from school, and we weren't allowed to go outside and play until our homework was finished.
Did you have any hobbies when you were growing up? What were they, and what attracted you to them?
Well, we ran around a lot. We collected baseball cards, played sports.
What did you do in the evenings after dinner when you were growing up?
Well, as much as we could. As soon as we finished dinner, we went out and played until we got called in.
How would you spend your weekends when you were growing up?
We'd go to the park. We'd play ball. Sometimes we'd hike through the park. Scouting activities, which would take us away for
You or
camping.
another family member play a musical instrument? If you did an instrument, how did you learn to play?
Played piano, and he picked it up himself. I did the same thing. I picked up piano myself. My sister had some lessons. I did have a few months of accordion lessons when I was about 6. And then later on, I learned how to play clarinet and saxophone in school.
What sort of magazines and books did your family like to read? Is there a book or a group of books that were important to you when you were growing up?
Every month we got something called Catholic Digest, which was like the Reader's Digest, which we also got, but it was for Catholic families.
What was it like to go to the movies when you were growing up? How much did it cost, and what stars and films were your
Movies,
favorite?
as I remember, were only about like 25 or 35 cents. We did go to drive-ins when we were, during the summers as a family, and we watched. I remember seeing Danny Kaye films, a lot of things that Disney came out with in the 50s.
If your family took a vacation, where would they go? How would they get there, and what did they do?
I remember 2 vacations that we took. We went to Florida, where my aunt and uncle had moved. They lived in Tampa, Florida, and we drove an old beat-up car and stopped at hotels or motels along the way. Would point out different things that were different from growing up in New Jersey. Segregation of races. It was very important to him that we knew that that it shouldn't be that way. So he would point out segregated hotels or drinking fountains and explain, how wrong that was.
What was it like when you went to big family gatherings as a child? Where would they be held? Who would attend? And how did everyone act?
We generally held the family gatherings because we had there were 5 kids in the house. I remember we would have a few relatives come over. We had this aunt and uncle who didn't have any children, so they would always come over, and then there was a cousin of my mother's who would share the holiday with us. Sometimes my sister, who was working in pediatrics, would bring home one of the babies, which they were allowed to do back in the 1960s. The little babies who didn't have any families, she would be allowed to bring home for a holiday and take care of them.
Was there a family member that you considered a character? What stories did you or your family tell that best illustrates that person's eccentricity?
Yeah, the cousin of my mother's was certainly a character, and we thought that he was pretty extraordinary because he had traveled, he had gone out to California, and he had lived in California. His mother had died when he was very, very young, so he was, even though he was my mother's cousin, he was more like her brother because he grew up a lot with my mother. And he would tell stories. He would bring over little treats for us kids. And it was only much later when he died that we found out he was a very, very sad and lonely man. That we were the closest thing to family that he had ever had, relatively young.
Did anyone outside your immediate family live with you while you were growing up, such as aunts, uncles, cousins, or grandparents? If so, for how long and why?
My grandfather, my mother's father, lived with us. I barely remember him. He died when I was about
How many
4.
places did you live in while you were growing up? Where were they, and which ones do you consider your hometown?
Hillside, New Jersey. It was the only house that we had, and that house is still in our family. My sister and her family live in it.
What was your hometown like?
It was a it was a suburb. It was right between Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Newark, New Jersey. Apartment type houses. They're mostly one family houses and a few apartments here and there. I remember, I don't think that there was anybody who was extremely poor. Most of us were working class. Here and there were a few famous people. There was a ball player named Phil Rizzuto, back when ball players didn't make a lot of money, who lived a few blocks away from us.
Describe your hometown there, including its address, size, modern conveniences, and surroundings.
Well, I just did. Most of the families had a lot of kids. Ours was pretty typical. We had 5. Half of our neighbors were Catholic. Probably more than half. And there was one Jewish family.
Did you get to school each day, and what was the size of your class? If you were taught one-room style, what was the age range of your classmates?
We were able to walk 4 or 5 blocks to the Catholic school. Probably had upwards of 30. I remember my kindergarten class was 50-something kids, all taught by one tiny little nun. And we generally had well over 30 kids in the class.
How important was formal education to your family, and how far did your parents expect your education to go? Did your family want you to pursue a specific course of study or job path?
My sisters and I got good grades, and because my dad always regretted that he hadn't been able to go to school, he hadn't finished high school, he made it very, very important for us to do well in school. And we always expected that we would go to college. The 3 of us actually went to college, and I went on to do graduate work.
Did you like school? What were your favorite subjects and why?
Yeah, I was pretty good in school. I enjoyed it. I was always best at language arts. Although I enjoyed math.
What did you do the summer after your high school graduation?
I think I went right to work. I worked for a factory, worked in a mail room, and also threw around boxes, big transfile boxes, kept records, delivered mail, sorted mail, and kept record retention.
What were your plans for the rest of your life?
Well, at one time I was going to be a Catholic priest. I was planning to be a Catholic priest. Then I had always wanted to teach. Eventually I did become a teacher.
Did you have any after school or summer jobs when you were growing up? What were they and what were your responsibilities?
Uh, had a paper route. I was young, when I was probably about 10. Uh, Probably kept it up right to high school. During high school, we all had um, chores at the high school, whether we were working in the kitchen or um, porters, working cleaning um, grounds.
Is there another career that you wish you had pursued instead of the path you did choose?
Not really. For a while before my kids were born, I acted and directed a lot, but I've always kept that on the side, and now that I am about to retire, I am going to be doing that again. But I'm very glad that I was able to work as a teacher. I'm very glad that I was able to work as a teacher in the prison system because there are very few people who choose that as a career, and it's very necessary to help try to keep people from going back to prison.
If you could go back and change the way you handled your own finances, what would you do differently and
But I
why?
would have put aside a lot more money in a systematic way than I did.
Has your life turned out the way you thought it would when you were young?
Probably better. It occurred to me how rewarding it would be to work in the field that I did, or to have the marriage and family that I have.
What is your biggest risk you ever took in your life and how did it work out?
Probably getting married. I think that's probably the biggest risk for anyone. And it worked out okay.
Looking
Worked
back
out
at
very
your
well.
life, of what are you most proud of?
Probably probably my marriage, and my family. It was important to my own parents, my own father, uh, that people were a lot more important than things, and just being able to have been married as long as I've been married, and to raise kids who still want to see me. That's a pretty good a pretty good accomplishment.
When did you first vote for president? Who were the
The
candidates?
1972 election between Nixon and McGovern, and I voted for George McGovern.
Over the years, have you belonged to one or more political parties, and if so, what political policies or positions drew you to that party?
Um, I've mostly voted Democratic my whole life. I have voted for Republicans. I usually try to vote for the person. I found a lot more comfortable in the Democratic Party. The emphasis on people, uh, emphasis on family, emphasis on social responsibility. I found that to be a lot more welcoming in the Democratic Party.
Describe the world events that were most important in your lifetime.
Certainly Vietnam. Vietnam was the most important. The rise of the civil rights movement, which gave rise to the feminist movement. The second most important would have been September 11th.
What historical events and technologies do you feel most changed the world during your lifetime?
The rise of the civil rights movement and the World Trade Center. Technology would certainly be computers. There were computers when I was little, and it probably held less information than a pocket calculator. What computers have been able to do just in my working career has been extraordinary.
What is life like today that you could not have foreseen in your wildest imagination when you were a child?
Communications, information, and what we do with it. To be able to uh, examine facts and analyze facts and get facts instantly, that I could never ever have foreseen.
What do you expect life to be like 100 years from now?
I couldn't even answer that question. I think it depends on the choices we make, whether we're going to take control of our own lives or whether we're going to allow ourselves to be controlled by other people.
It's always